Prime Minister Carney is in China. How do you see the deals Canada and China have just signed, trade deals between the two partners?
Well, that's okay. That's what he should be doing. I mean, it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that.
The world has changed much since that last visit. And I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is touting a new strategic partnership with China in talks with Xi Jinping in Beijing as part of what he has said is a new world order, in part due to the fallout from Trump tariffs in the United States. Now, there's been a noticeable tone shift from Ottawa towards Beijing as Carney wraps up the first state visit to China by a Canadian leader in more than 8 years. Now, after a lengthy diplomatic chill, the two nations have signed a series of agreements, including an energy pact that could see more Chinese investment in Canada and open up opportunities for China to buy more Canadian oil and LNG. Also, in quite a breakthrough, Carney says Canada will allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada at a tariff of just 6.1%, down from 100%. Xi reciprocated, according to Carney, by reducing its 100% ag tariff on canola or rapeseed to 15%. Xi Jinping hailed the talks as having achieved positive results.
Canada just made a move that doesn't look like Canada. In January 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney becomes the first Canadian leader in 8 years to visit China. This involves 4 days of meetings, photo ops, trade language, and talk of resetting relations. Here's why it hit like a shock. Only months earlier, during a national debate, Carney described China as the most serious security threat to Canada. So what changed? Not China, Canada's position. Because this trip isn't a love letter to Beijing. It's a signal flare aimed at Washington, right before the USMCA CUSMA review opens. And the real story isn't Canada pivots to China. The real story is this. Canada is trying to reduce US veto power over its economy. Let's break the script. Carney's China trip is being framed as diplomacy, trade, and engagement. But timing is never neutral in geopolitics. This visit lands just as North America is walking into a high-stakes moment, the mandatory 2026 review of USMCA. This is the trade agreement that governs the continental bloodstream, supply chains, autos, agriculture, manufacturing, investment confidence, jobs, prices. And in the months leading up to this review, Canada has been living under a reality it hasn't fully admitted to itself. That the U.S. is becoming a less predictable anchor. Tariff threats, negotiation freezes, political volatility, and the growing use of trade tools as pressure tools. In that environment, a trip to China is not contradictory. It's strategic insurance. Because Canada is learning a hard lesson the global South has known for decades. When your economy depends on one dominant partner, you don't have stability, you have conditional access. And conditional access is leverage. To understand why this trip is happening now, you have to look at the economic signal that hit like a warning light. By October 2025, Canada's export share going to the US hit its lowest level since 1997, a structural milestone for a country built on US market access. That doesn't mean Canada is suddenly free. It means the old assumption that the US market is always stable, always open, always predictable, is eroding at the exact moment Washington is becoming more volatile. And when the foundation shakes, elites do what elites always do. They search for a second door. That's what China represents here, not a replacement for the US, but an alternative channel. A bargaining chip. A hedge. A warning to the US that Canada has options. And Beijing has been positioning itself as the voice of multilateral trade, open markets, cooperation, institutions, precisely as Washington leans more unilateral. That's why Carney's language matters. During the trip, he signaled support for what he called a multilateral New World Order, a language that tells you this mission wasn't just salesmanship, it was strategy. Now here's the tension people keep missing. Carney can call China a security threat and still court it economically because Canada is trying to operate in a world where security and trade have been fused into one weaponized system. This is the new era. Countries are told to pick a side, but the global economy is built to punish anyone who only has one customer. So Canada is trying to do what many countries have tried to do, which is separate its security posture from its economic survival. But that separation is collapsing everywhere. Because trade is no longer just trade. Trade is influence. Trade is discipline. Trade is punishment. Trade is alignment. And the US has been demonstrating that alignment matters more than rules. Which brings us back to USMCA. This review is supposed to be a check-in, but check-ins become showdowns when power is unequal. The US enters the review as the dominant market with the dominant currency, dominant investment gravity, and dominant ability to absorb shocks. Canada enters the review as a deeply integrated neighbor, whose economy remains structurally tied to US market access. Geography is not neutral. Infrastructure is not neutral. Supply chains are not neutral. They are dependency structures. So if Washington wants concessions on market access, industrial policy, digital rules, procurement, agricultural protections, it has a weapon: uncertainty. And when uncertainty becomes the weapon, the best defense is options. That is what Carney's China trip is really about. It's not Beijing's friendship, it's Ottawa's breathing room. And if you want the simplest translation of what's happening, it's this. Canada is trying to walk into the USMCA review with a message it rarely sends. We can diversify, because the fear inside Ottawa is obvious. If the US uses the review to threaten, squeeze, or destabilize the framework, Canada's dependence becomes a bargaining table liability. And Carney's Beijing optics, the handshake, the partnership language, the trade expansion talk, all of it functions as political signaling. Signal to the US. We have alternatives. Signal to China, we are open for business. Signal to Canadians, we're not trapped. Signal to investors, Canada is managing risk. But now we have to deal with the moral and geopolitical contradiction head-on. If China is Canada's biggest security threat, why invite deeper economic interdependence? Because this is what middle powers do when empires compete. They hedge. And hedging looks like hypocrisy when you pretend the world is governed by principles alone. It's not. It's governed by power. Here's where Liberation Lens goes deeper. Watch how the rules-based order talks about everyone else. When African states trade with China, it's called debt trap diplomacy. When Latin American states take Chinese investment, it's foreign infiltration. When Asian states refuse to align with Washington, it's strategic ambiguity, said like an insult. But when Canada, a core Western ally, moves toward Beijing under pressure, it's suddenly framed as pragmatic engagement. Same action. Different moral labeling. Because the real rule of the system is not values. The real rule is this. Everyone hedges, but only some are allowed to call it strategy. Now let's make it even clearer by putting Canada's move into the global hypocrisy mirror. The United States rejects spheres of influence when Russia invokes them in Eastern Europe. The US rejects historical claims when China invokes them over Taiwan. Washington calls those arguments imperial, dangerous, illegitimate. But then the US speaks in its own sphere language in the Americas. Our hemisphere, our backyard, adversaries don't belong here. Same structure, different branding. And when Iran resists US pressure, sanctions are used to create economic hardship, not just to punish a government, but to pressure society. The public message becomes freedom. The operational reality becomes coercion. So what Canada is experiencing is not an anomaly. It's the softer version of a global pattern. Policy is increasingly organized around blocks, coercion tools, and alignment tests. And in that world, Canada, despite being rich, finds itself behaving like many dependent economies, constantly managing the preferences of the dominant partner. That's why Carney's China trip matters. It's not Canada becomes pro-China, it's Canada tries to reduce U.S. leverage. But here's the uncomfortable part. Hedging has limits. Because China is not just a market, it's also a geopolitical rival of the United States. So every Canadian attempt to diversify becomes, in Washington's eyes, not economic logic, but strategic drift. And strategic drift is punished. That's the trap Canada is walking into. Diversify too little, and you remain exposed to U.S. leverage. Diversify too much, and you invite U.S. pressure for alignment. This is the middle power squeeze in the age of bloc politics. And that's the deeper lesson for everyone watching from outside the West. Even allies get managed. Even allies get disciplined. Even allies get reminded who holds the system's master key. So what should viewers take from this episode? 1. Carney's contradiction is not confusion, it's insurance. 2. The USMCA review is not just trade administration, it's leverage politics. 3. Canada's dependence is structural, and structures don't disappear because you take a diplomatic trip. 4. The New World Order talk sounds noble, but the real world order is increasingly a contest of blocks, not ideals. 5. And the hypocrisy is the signal. When the powerful hedge, it's called strategy. When the rest hedge, it's called threat. Carney's trip is a sign that Canada is quietly preparing for a world where the U.S. is no longer the automatic center of its economic universe. Not because Canada suddenly wants confrontation, but because Canada is trying to survive volatility. And if the USMCA review turns hostile, this Beijing trip will look less like a photo op and more like a warning shot. The question isn't whether Canada should trade with China. The question is whether Canada can ever be fully sovereign while its economic lifelines remain so concentrated and so exposed to a partner that can turn policy into pressure overnight. That is the real story. And as the USMCA review begins, we'll see whether Washington treats Canada like a partner or like a dependency that tried to open a second door. This is Liberation Lens. We don't just follow headlines, we follow the power underneath them.